Then again, it's reminded that it's been suggested that every character and every archetype and every symbol in every story is an aspect of ourself. But to start with, there's a slightly off-colour story for us. And we know there are stories about old Fred, but this is a story about when old Fred was getting married. He was quite young, but his fiancée, before the wedding day, the mother of his fiancée called his bride to be aside, and pointing her finger at him, she said to the girl, "Now you just remember my advice, never let your husband see you naked." So the wedding took place, grand affair, and they went off for their honeymoon. And when they came back from their honeymoon, Fred was down at the pub talking to his friends, and they were asking him, you know, how's married life for you? And Fred said, oh, it's marvelous, our sex life is so great. He said, but there's one thing, my wife has this funny quirk. She always wears a hat to bed. And then there's a story about a young woman called Habiba. Now, Habiba was born into the family as the only daughter of a very, very rich merchant who pandered to her every need and desire. But she was a very precocious child, very intelligent, very active, you could call maybe a little bit tomboyish. She loved to climb trees, and she loved challenges that came along to her. But Habiba came to the age of 14 years old, and her father called her to him and said, well, now you are of marriageable age, and we're going to find a suitable husband for you. And then her mother called Habiba to her and scolded her roundly and said, now you have to be grown up, you have to be responsible, it is time for you to be married. Well, Habiba was reluctant to do this, and she said to her mother, well, I don't want to grow up. But her mother insisted that now she was of that age, and when she became a wife, she would have to become a responsible human being. So a husband was found for her, and it happened to be a young man by the name of Yusuf. Now Yusuf had lost his parents, they had died and left him an orphan, but he had been able to find an apprenticeship with a man who worked with metals. So Yusuf learned the ways of making wagon wheels and those pieces of equipment that tilled the soil and so forth. So he became a very adept artisan, and it was expected that when his employer passed on, that the business would go to him. He was a diligent, faithful worker, and he saved enough money even to build himself a little house so that he would make a suitable husband for someone. So the wedding was arranged with Habiba, and the marriage was a grand affair. So Habiba, of course, came to live in Yusuf's house, and Yusuf very happily went off to work, expecting that when he came home that his new wife would have a meal prepared for him and that the house would be clean. It had been found that she was shy of intimacy, and he thought to himself this was just because she was very young and an innocent and virginal young being. But when he came home from work, nothing had been done. There was his young wife sitting in a corner with her arms around her knees. And when her husband asked her how she was, she said, "I'm frightened." So instead of expecting Habiba to get the meal and clean, he did it himself. And this went on day after day, no change. Even when Yusuf asked her, "What is it that is troubling you?" she would just say, "I'm frightened." And he would say, "But you're here with me now. You're safe. I'm taking care of you." But she did nothing in the house. He would come home and she would be sitting in the corner with her hands around her knees. Nothing having been done, the house not cleaned and no food prepared. And the same answer was there all the time. "I'm frightened." But one day Yusuf came home and he found Habiba in a happier frame of mind. And he asked her what it was. And she said, "I've been invited to my friend's wedding. It's in the next village to where we live." And so Habiba was happier than he'd seen her at all, even though she still didn't do anything at all in the house. There was still no intimacy, there was nothing cleaned and no food prepared. But her whole demeanor was happier in anticipation of going off to her friend's wedding. Now, of course, Yusuf had also been invited, as were other male members of other families. But Yusuf decided that he would not go because he wanted to stay home and ponder on his very difficult situation with his wife. So Habiba went off to the wedding in the village next to their own. But Yusuf, instead of sitting and pondering his fate, decided that he would go and see what was happening at this wedding. So he went, and keeping quiet and keeping in the background, in fact he climbed up on the roof where all of the festivities were going on, and there he saw his wife Habiba in the center of a group, laughing and joking, and he happened to listen to the conversation that was going on. And the conversation was with Habiba in the center saying, "I'm fearless, I'm not afraid of anything, I can do anything." Well, of course, Yusuf almost fell off the roof when he heard all of this going on, but he listened to more, and after the festivities were over, the friends of Habiba said, "Well, let's make a wager with you. If you're fearless, you can go into a cemetery and cook some halwa and bring it back to us, and we'll give you gifts if you're able to do this." So, hearing this, when Habiba went off with her utensils to make the halwa, Yusuf took himself off to the cemetery, and he happened to find an old piece of cloth that had been covering over one of the bodies that were waiting there to be buried, and he clad himself in that, and he hid. And his wife Habiba came in, and she found a few little bits of kindling, and she made herself a little fire, and she started to cook the ingredients for the halwa, the honey and the butter, and so forth. And when this was prepared, Yusuf, who had sidled up to where Habiba was doing her cooking, he said, "You should feed the dead as well as the living." But Habiba took her hot spoon out of the pot of halwa and whacked his hand with it. So he again, as she went on with her stirring, said the same, "You should feed the dead as well as the living." And again she gave him another whack with her hot spoon. But he was not to be deterred, and so he asked her again, and this time she gave him a good whack on the chest so that he recoiled back because his chest was burned. So he went back to his little hiding place, and Habiba took her cooked halwa and took it back to her friends and claimed all the gifts that they had promised her, because she had done exactly what she had said that she would do. And Yusuf made his way home. And eventually his wife Habiba came back. And Yusuf went off to work. And when he came home, there was his wife sitting in the corner with her hands around her knees. And when he asked her why she had not done any housework or cooked him a meal, she grabbed her knees more tightly and said, "I'm frightened." So of course now, Yusuf being onto it, he said to her, "Look at this." And he bared his chest with the burn mark of the spoon on it. He said, "Where is my fearless wife who can strike those who are said to be dead? I am that corpse, and you are not what you seem." So Yusuf was about to enter into a tirade to his wife when all of a sudden there was a great transformation in Habiba. And she apologized. "Please, please, please forgive me, my beloved husband, because when I started this, I was testing you to see whether you were going to be a good husband. But it became such a habit with me, I didn't know how to break it." And they embraced, and their married life began from that moment onward. If every aspect, character, symbol, archetype in every story is a part of our own psyche, what do these stories mean for you? Do we still have a Habiba in us? Some habit that has not yet been broken, that disallows us from the wedding of the aspects of ourself, bringing it down to the male-female, if you would call it that, subjective, objective, parts of ourself, creating separateness, not only with ourselves, but with life. Because if we're not together in ourselves, we're certainly not capable of having a relationship with life. Is there still a Habiba in us? What's the meaning of this story for you? Even the story of old Fred. Are we wearing a hat to bed? Are we still caught in some habitual thinking? What's the meaning of the story for